The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello attendees and welcome to the World Teach Marshall Island Year webinar. We are so excited to have you on the line. My name is Caitlin Ivester. I'm the Director of Communications at World Teach, and I'm eager to share more about our program in the RMI with you tonight. So thank you so much again for joining us as we discuss training, placements, culture, and the volunteer experience in their local classroom and broader community. Amongst our listeners this evening, we have some new applicants, those that have just been accepted into the program, and others that are interested in learning more about World Teach and Marshall Islands. We also have a very distinguished panel made up of two current and former Marshall Islands volunteers, one currently in the Marshalls and then one who is a returned alum of the and also our field staff from the Marshall Islands program, and several of whom are direct from the Marshall Islands right now, so we're excited to welcome them. So what we are going to do to start is go over our agenda. So we'll spend a few minutes meeting our panelists and local field staff and learning a bit about their backgrounds. Then we'll get into some of the topics of discussion that you see listed here. So you can think of it as your journey through the program and what to expect and prepare for during your time in the Marshall Islands. This will include arrival, orientation, day-to-day life in your placement, immersion strategies, the volunteer experience in the classroom, and so on. And then finally, we'll go a little bit over the application process, qualifications and deadlines, along with program fees and support. And then at the end, we'll dedicate a little time to a question and answer session with our panelists. Throughout the webinar, you can submit questions through the chat function that you should see on your screen. We will wait until the end to address them as a group. So for now, let's continue on and have our panelists introduce themselves. From here on out, they will be the stars of the show. So first on the line with us is Melissa Fairless, the RMI Field Director, coming to us all the way from the Republic of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. Melissa, good evening. Could you please introduce yourself, just give us a little information about your background and describe your role with World Teach?
Hi, I'm Melissa. I'm the current Field Director for the Marshall Islands program. I'm in my second year as Field Director here. You can read all the specifics there, but I was a former Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador, and that's actually where I first encountered World Teach and helped them to put some volunteers in my town of Guaranda there. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. And we also have here with us Christian Colo, the RMI Assistant Field Director, and it's great to have you on the line as well, Christian. So could you also give us just a quick introduction and tell us about how you got involved with World Teach, as well as what your main role is on the support team now?
Yeah, hello everyone that's listening. My name is Christian, and I am, like Caitlin said, I'm the Assistant Field Director currently, and I was originally planning on teaching in the States, but I also had an urge to travel and see the world, so I came to the Marshall Islands last year as a volunteer, and a World Teach volunteer. I taught in one of the outer islands, and then I returned for this current year as the Assistant Field Director, and I'm kind of, I manage kind of like the volunteer support and just communicating with our volunteers on a regular basis. That's kind of my main role here in the Marshall Islands.
Wonderful, Christian. Thanks for going into that in a little more detail. And we are also so lucky. Oh, I forgot to switch over to Christian's screen there, but you can see that great picture of him. And I will quickly move over to the next screen, which is for our alumni and then our in-country volunteer who's with us tonight. We're very lucky to have these two representatives of the RMI program joining us. So one, Carol, is an alum of the 2016 program. And we have one current volunteer in the Marshalls as well. So I'll have you ladies introduce yourselves briefly. So let's start with Carol. Carol, could you tell us a little bit about where you were placed in the Marshall Islands during your time there and where you are now?
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Carol. While I was in the Marshalls, I was actually there from 2015 to 2017. I returned for a second year, and I spent my time on Namrek Atoll on Namrek Island, working in Namrek Elementary School as an elementary level volunteer teaching English. Now I am actually in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, so if my audio is a little choppy, that's why, and sorry. And I'm working for a small NGO that does a lot to support small grassroots organizations in Haiti that are trying to do sustainable development projects in anything from reforestation to education to pretty much anything, medical, anything like that. Yeah, so that's me.
Awesome, Carol. Thanks so much for sharing that and for joining us from Haiti as well. And it's just great to have you here as a representative too, because you, as you mentioned to the audience, you extended for a year, which is something that a lot of people have decided to do for the Marshall Islands so that they can stay a second year in their community. So it's really great to have you as a representative. Thank you for that. And let's have Caroline, if you could answer the same question. So just where you are now in the Marshall Islands. And maybe just tell us what atoll you're in and the name of your school and kind of your role in the school.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name's Caroline. I am currently on Nazaro, the capital atoll, in Ryrick, and teaching at Long Island Elementary School. I'm teaching English to grades 3 and 6.
Awesome, Caroline. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. And I think it's really great to have you ladies here as a group because it just really kind of displays the variety of placements that you can have in the Marshall Islands. Outer Island versus Main Island, living in the host family versus a dorm. You've all had really varied experiences. So we'll be diving into those soon. But first, we're going to have Melissa and Christian cover the topic of the first few days in country and the World Teach orientation. So, Melissa, let's have you start with some orientation basics. So if you could answer for us some of these questions. Where will the volunteers be staying during orientation? How long will the orientation be? What are 2 to 3 of the most important topics that the World Teach cohort will learn during orientation?
All right, so where the orientation will be, we have orientation in a local elementary school, and we have some rooms for teaching practice, and some rooms are for like dormitory style. So we get mattresses. You get to sleep Marshallese style on the floor, and you have your own room with a little small group of people. You do everything from the school, from cooking to teaching to showering. And this past year, we actually had a school that had internet access, so volunteers could email family and friends directly from the elementary school. As for how long it will be, it'll be approximately 3 weeks, 6 days a week. So Sundays are always free. That's a good thing to get used to here in the Marshall Islands, as most things don't operate on Sundays. But for 6 days a week, we have different activities planned. At least one of those days will be something really fun, like going to a beach or taking a day trip to a local island. So it's not going to be a lot of work every single day. We do get breaks throughout that. And what we cover, the main thing, of course, is teaching. So the bulk of what we do during orientation is going over how to teach, whether you're going to teach high school, elementary school, outer island, Madro. We cover different methods of teaching different things in different ways. In addition to that, we also cover culture. So in past years, we've done Marshallese language lessons. Volunteers have been able to participate in weaving, like pom-pom weaving to make baskets. They've been able to ride on the traditional Marshallese canoes. So there's all kinds of different options available depending on what the next FD would like to do for that. And finally, we cover health and safety. That's a big issue here as well. So anything from boat safety to water safety, but don't touch it, how to take care of yourself both mentally and physically, what kinds of medicines are available on island. And also we have the sheriff come in, and he kind of just talks about how to do things in Madro. It's a fairly safe place. Actually, I would say it's probably one of the safest places I've ever lived in the world. But that being said, you do have to watch yourself and, you know, make sure that you're not purposely leaving all your money somewhere or like leaving your digital camera out, because, you know, like anywhere else in the world, someone's just going to walk by and pick that up. So that's a little brief introduction for orientation.
Awesome, Melissa. Thank you so much for sharing that with so much detail. And it's really great for me to hear, too, how many guest speakers you have come in and what a great introduction it is to the local environment and culture. And, of course, how much you guys care as a staff about the health and safety of the volunteers. So thank you for sharing. And my next question will be for Christian. And Christian, so what do you find are some things, and of course, Melissa, feel free to jump in if anything comes to mind, that often surprise the cohort when their first few days when they're arriving in the Marshall Islands?
I think one of the big things is just the heat. Like everyone knows that the Marshall Islands are near the equator, it's hot, but then you step off that plane for the first time and you're just like, whoa, this is like really, really hot. So, and you know, I think that leads to a lot of like mental and just physical exhaustion for the first few weeks or, you know, the first month here. So orientation can be pretty exhausting, just, you know, the new environment, the heat, just the physical exertion. But overall, you know, it's a great time. I think another big part of Marshallese culture that people aren't used to and they may be surprised by is that, especially for foreigners coming into the country, the Marshallese people have a tendency to like stare, or they're always interested in what the foreigners are doing. So you may be surprised when you first arrive, and you know, everywhere you go, you have people like staring at you, wondering what you're doing or why you're doing it. So, and that's just part of Marshallese culture. You know, it's not meant to be rude or uncomfortable. That's just the way things are here. And so, you know, after, you know, a little bit of time, you'll get used to it and it's not a big deal. And then in terms of Madro, I think one of the things that often surprises people is that it's not like the island tropical paradise that one might expect. You know, there are plenty of incredibly beautiful places in the Marshall Islands, but Madro itself is actually a very populated, crowded place. There's a lot of buildings, a lot of businesses, a lot of people. It's a small island, so there, you know, a lot of the problems that you see in overcrowded places around the world, you can also find that here in Madro. So while there are plenty of beautiful places to be found in Madro, and you'll see some of those during orientation, it's also important to remember that, you know, downtown Madro or the main parts of Madro are not as islandy as one might expect.
Thanks, Christian. And I bet you Carol and Caroline can relate to that as well. And it's funny to hear you mention the heat as your first one. I think it seems obvious, but if you've never been in that kind of heat before, it can really throw you for a loop. I will say to the attendees, I've had quite a few alumni tell me that by the end of the year, there were times when they were cold. So you do adjust. So my next questions will be for Carol. And then Caroline, if you have any insights, I'd love for you to jump in as well. What would you say, Carol, were some of the main benefits of the World Teach Orientation?
Well, so I came in with no teaching background. I was not an education major in college. You know, I'd done some tutoring and stuff, but had never been in front of a classroom in charge of it. So, I mean, it was definitely a benefit to have teacher training, and to have training on all aspects of Marshallese culture, because in a lot of ways, you can read everything that's online and still miss a lot because there's just not a ton online. So there is those like obvious benefits, but I would say really the biggest benefit was bonding with the other volunteers. And I chuckle because sometimes that was also like the most stressful part, because you do suddenly get thrown in with a group of 20, 30 strangers, and you are with them pretty much 24/7, and you're spending a lot of time in classroom in doing the activities and stuff, which are great and they are varied, but you're still with the same group of people who you only just met. It's really intense, kind of like freshman dorm flashbacks in some ways. but it really bonds you. And honestly, going forward, those are like the best support system is your fellow volunteers. And I mean, even now, I still talk to many of the volunteers, and that was like definitely started at orientation. Yeah, so I would say those relationships that you form because you have to are one of the huge benefits. And part of that is fostered by the fact that orientation, everyone's disoriented because they've just arrived in the country. It is really hot and there's no air conditioning really where you're staying. So you're bonding over just like those kind of things. And also just, hey, like I'm gonna go to the store and see what happens. Do you want to come? Is suddenly like a good offer. So some of the what could be considered downsides of orientation and of adjusting to the country can be mitigated by those relationships as well.
That's great, Carol. Thanks. And I like your little pun there about disorientation and orientation. I think that sums it up really well. And Caroline, is there anything you'd like to add to that about any benefits that you really found stood out from orientation?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Carol said about just bonding with other volunteers because they are a huge support system for your year here. But then since orientation is on Mazro, it's kind of like a benefit for the volunteers that are on this island because you get to go around and see the stores, the restaurants, the little things to do. So I think that's also a little benefit of orientation that we haven't noticed yet.
Whereas for outer islanders, that's the worst thing ever because you spend the whole time hearing, it'll be different on your island, you'll have to figure it out on your island, which is totally true, but really frustrating when the Mazro people are actually figuring it out.
That's a really good point, Carol, that I think will kind of be underscoring the differences between the main island and outer island placements throughout the webinar. So that's a good point to bring up. And that actually leads us well into our next section, which is after orientation, volunteers are ready to head off to their placements. So as we have seen already in the placement or in the marshals, placements can differ greatly from each other depending on the size and location of your community. And the best way to really hear about those differences, I would say, is just straight from the source. So I'm excited to ask our current and former volunteers about their personal experiences. We'll start with Caroline, and then we'll have Carol share her experiences. And Caroline, my first question for you is, it's a little bit general, but what is your living situation like? What are the housing and accommodations like, the commute and so on? What is your community like?
Okay, so I live in Ryrick, which is part of Mazro, and I am with a host family. Host family size can vary, but I just have a host mom, a host dad, and a host brother. So there are 4 of us total in the house pretty regularly. I have my own bedroom, my own bathroom, and I have screening on my window and a lock on my door. And then our host house has 2 other bedrooms, 1 other bathroom, kind of like a lounge living space and a kitchen. The kitchen is probably what surprised me the most because there's really just a sink, a big freezer chest, and then kind of like one of those portable oven stove things. So there's no actual oven, it's just one stove coil. And then I live on the lagoon side, so we have kind of like a sandy drive, lots of local plants like coconut trees, pandanus, and then I have access to the lagoon, so I can go swimming in my backyard. It's corally, not sandy for the actual swimming, no. And then my house is a 7-minute walk from school. You can always taxi if it's raining because taxis are always available. I think that answered about everything.
Yeah, it definitely did, Caroline. That was great. And Carol, what about your placements? So thinking about in terms of housing, commute to school and kind of what generally your accommodations were like.
Okay, so as I said, I was on an outer island, which is very, very different. So I lived in probably the nicest house on the island. My host family was pretty well off, very well respected in the community, as often host families are. But that being said, I had the only bedroom in the house. I did have my own room with screen on the window that was mostly intact. There was one bathroom in the house that we all shared, and then there was kind of 2 rooms in the house, one of which was just kind of like day-to-day, changed what was used, kind of empty. And then the other one was kind of set up as more living space for the family. So we had a kitchen corner that had some, like a sink to wash dishes in that you had to fill up with water from the well. And as Caroline talked about, the little gas stove that's just the one burner. But then we also had a cookhouse, which is where most of the cooking and kitchen type things actually happened. That was outside, which is not uncommon on an outer island at all. And so that was the house. My host family was much bigger than Caroline's. I lived with my host mama, her daughter, who was my host sister then, my host sister's husband. There are 3 kids, and then part of the time we also had another kid who was my host mama's grandson, but not really, or it was my host sister who lived with me's nephew. And yeah, so it was a lot bigger, which I think is very common on outer islands to have the bigger families. And it's also pretty common to have just like extra kids around. So yeah, we also sometimes would have other kids living with us for a while, just to have like an older girl around to help with the baby and things like that. So for sometimes there were extra kids living in my house for a couple months, and you just kind of had to roll with that. But overall, my housing situation, no complaints. It was very nice. It was a big house, and we had a roof catchment, which meant that I could like kind of shower, not just take a bucket shower. So high luxury. Also, so Namrik is an awesome placement. And pretty much every house on Namrik does have a freezer and a solar panel because of a development grant that was several years ago now. So I did have good solar power and a freezer access, which is not necessarily common. I was definitely a little spoiled, but that was awesome. My commute to school was 10 minutes if I walked with kids, and like 3 minutes if I walked by myself, because kids hanging off of you makes it take a lot longer. But so it was not far at all. Nothing is ever very far on the island. And there were not taxis if it was raining, but you just don't have school if it's raining, so it's all good. And yeah, so was that everything?
Yeah, that about covers it, Carol. That's great. And I can confirm for the audience that we do have a picture, at least one, of Carol with a kid hanging off of her. So I can imagine that the walk did take a little bit longer with that entourage. That's great. So we'll go back to Caroline to start again, and we'll ask about my favorite topic, which is food. So I'm wondering, what was your typical diet like in the Marshalls? And if you had a favorite food, or if you have a favorite food, what is it?
Okay, so I actually just had lasagna for lunch. So on the main island, food, you have a lot more options if you want them. But since I'm with my host family, they feed me. It's typically rice and some type of meat. It ranges from chicken that's normally fried to pork, or something from a can like Spam or corned beef. And then my host family quickly realized that I love fruits and vegetables, so they kind of spoil me. We'll buy like a bag of frozen mixed vegetables and throw that in with the meat. So I definitely got very lucky with my placement. Like I said, you can buy almost anything on the island. There's restaurants you can go to get food, or even just like little kind of window shops that'll make $3 plates. You can get like fancy coffee drinks, things like that. My personal favorite thing that's here is the Chinese food. There's a handful of those places. You can get pizza, cheeseburgers, really anything from home. But my favorite food would definitely be coconuts. My host dad, every day when I come home from school, will offer me one just from our yard, which is super nice. And I think that's what I'll miss the most once I'm not here anymore.
Awesome, Caroline. Thank you. And Carol, how about you?
There was no lasagna on the outer islands, I can tell you that. So on the outer islands, the diet tends to be a lot more limited, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. So where I was, which is all I can really speak to, we actually did get a lot of fresh fish and fresh seafood, which was amazing. It's the kind of thing where like never in my life did I think I would ever be like, oh, I'm so sick of raw tuna. Why do we have to keep having fresh sashimi? But I did, because there was a time during tuna season where I was eating just like literally just a hunk of raw tuna, 10 meals a week maybe, which is kind of amazing. So there was like total perks like that. On the other hand, you're pretty much going to eat rice, fish, or rice and canned meat almost every meal, which can get a little repetitive, and especially if like canned meat on island is running out, because you only get the supply ship every so often. You know, you might end up eating Vienna sausages and rice a couple nights in a row, which gets old really fast. The biggest thing with food is that I didn't really have control, not just because my host family was feeding me, but because I didn't really have like I couldn't go out to a restaurant or something. I had a little bit of food that I had brought with me, so I had like snacks to supplement. But I was pretty much going to be eating whatever my host family was eating, which again was very good overall. I got to try octopus, turtle, shark, crab, coconut crab, and mangrove crab, which are totally different. All kinds of other delicious, delicious seafood, oyster, clam. And so those are probably my favorite foods. Can I cheat and say foods? I loved when we get some like weird seafood, because that's who I am. Not a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, so I definitely can't highlight that. Not a lot of frozen fruits and vegetables either. Pandanus, though, was a very pleasant surprise whenever I got it. You just like suck the juice of it out, so it's a really graceful thing to eat, but really delicious and quite a treat.
Awesome, Carol. Thanks for those insights. And Caroline, those were really descriptive and I think highlighted the differences between Maine and Outer Islands really well. And let's spend some time now talking about the best ways to fully integrate into your new home and adapt to this new culture. So let's start with you, Carol, just by asking, how did you get involved in your community? How did you spend your free time there?
So having a host family made it really easy to get involved in my community, because they just kind of took me along to everything. So anytime anything was going on island, pretty much everyone attends most of the time. So I just kind of got took along with you, which was an interesting experience sometimes, because there were times where I was just like doing whatever, and my host sister would be like, hey, we're going to a funeral like right now, get ready. And I'm just like, oh, like what? Or it would be like, oh, we're going to a birthday party. Oh, it's 10 o'clock at night. You're getting ready for bed. But what we're actually going to do is go sing happy birthday to somebody, which was awesome, though, because it was so fun. Another thing I did was join it's called Beat group, which is just a specific style of dance. They call it like Western fusion. Although I don't think that really describes it very well, but at Christmas time, beat groups form, usually in the churches, and a lot of the social life is around the church, especially on outer islands. And so basically starting in late October, early November, every night there would be beat practice, so it would be singing practice and dance practice in order to perform in church on Gospel Day, which is the first weekend in December and marks when the gospel arrived in the Marshall Islands, and then on Christmas. So that is like what everyone is doing around that time of year. It was a lot of fun. It was a great way to interact with people and to meet people and to like get compliments, because if you can stand up and like step to a beat, they're like, oh, we're so impressed. Even though I'm like, everyone else is better than me. So, yeah.
Awesome, Carol. Thank you. And how about you, Caroline? What ways have you been involved in your community, and how have you been spending your free time?
So the community on Majuro, there's definitely the local community, which I've easily gotten involved with through my host family. So like Carol, I'll just be like, we're going to a birthday party or a funeral, or we're going on a Jambo, which is like a cruise around town. And then church is also a very good way to get involved with the local community here, because a good amount of people go to church every Sunday. So this is the one that's down the street from your house, or you can be picky and go to one across town if you like that community. So that's kind of cool how that's offered. But then there's also a decent amount of expats here in Majuro that is kind of like another community to get involved with and integrated with. So that club that meets weekly for dinner, and there's just kind of like another group of people to meet and to chat with. There's the other volunteers on the island who it's kind of easy to get integrated into their communities too. And then there's a bill fishing club, which is just like a deep sea fishing group that's mainly Marshallese men. So it's just like another way to meet new people and to share your stories, things like that. And then for my free time, I typically during the week just relax at home. I hang out with my host family and my host brother. I've done a lot of reading this year. But then over the weekend, my free time, I go sailing with some of the people in Yacht Club, or I'll go deep sea fishing with the Bill Fishing Club, or just kind of go and hang out with people. There's a ton of different groups here, a lot of different people you can relax, hang out with. It's just kind of like a lot of doing nothing, but having fun with it.
That's so great, Caroline. It's so great to hear about what a dynamic kind of extracurricular life you guys have put together. And I guess another follow-up question that I think you kind of hinted at with the idea of a few communities in Majuro, and we'll start with Carol for this, but what would you say, Carol, are some things volunteers should know about Marshallese culture that will enable them to maximize their immersion inside their community?
I think the biggest thing is that Marshallese people can be very shy is one thing. It took a long time for people to start talking to me first, like to start a conversation with me, but we're totally happy if I started talking to them. So you kind of have to be the one to put yourself out there in a lot of ways. Which on the other side of that though, the kids are a little bit shy at first, but they get over that really, really fast. And I found the kids to be a very good way to kind of integrate myself a little more, because when you're being walked around by like 10 kids, practically someone is related to almost every kid in that group on the island, and everyone knows them. And it's a good way to kind of like enter different spaces, because the kids will just be like, oh yeah, come into my house. And then you're like, hi, Mom. Like, let's try and chat in Marshallese. And everyone's really, really nice once you do talk to them, but they're not going to be the first ones to do it a lot of times. So I would say that's one of the biggest things. And yeah.
Great, Carol. Thank you. And Caroline, would you have anything to add on to that?
I definitely agree with what Carol said about being shy. That's so true at the beginning. They take a while to warm up. Another thing I'd say is that religion, like I kind of mentioned already, is big here, but it doesn't totally rule the culture. I think that was kind of what I was expecting, but it's just kind of like for those who do it, they do it. Those who don't, it's no big deal.
Just as a follow-up too, they might be shy, but they are still paying attention to you, would be the other thing actually that I probably should mention. Even if you're doing nothing interesting, being a white person makes you interesting, or anything that's not Marshallese, a rebelle. So even though you don't, like, people might not be talking to you, they still know pretty much everything about you. And that was tested a couple times when, like, a kid would just come up to me and be like, so, like, you were swimming yesterday. And I'm like, you live on the other side of the island. How do you know this? But you're the center of gossip. And so just, like, be aware. Everyone's paying attention to you.
Yeah, that's a really great point that both of you guys bring up, and thank you for sharing your insights. And that I'll actually extend that same question or a similar one to Melissa and Christian. Just as volunteers begin to assimilate into their local communities, are there some successful strategies that you would recommend? We can start with Melissa for that one and then have Christian give his reply.
I think if you're living with a host family, you kind of get built into the culture. You have all this access, but it's up to you to say yes. So when they say, hey, we're going to a birthday party, do you want to come? You have to say yes, and you have to go. And you're like, it's 10 o'clock. I really should go to sleep. But just say yes, and you'll have some great experiences. In Madro, it's a little bit more difficult, or wherever you're going to be living on your own in teacher housing. So you really have to kind of just start talking to people in the community, talking with other teachers at your school. Just say, like, hey, what's going on? What activities are there? And just kind of get involved with things. And at first it might be a little bit tricky, but then as Caroline was saying, she's members of all these different clubs, including the Billfish Club, which is almost exclusively men, but there's been several female volunteers this year who have successfully participated, and they're doing great this year. They've managed to become members of all different kinds of organizations. There was a musical. They did Grease in the Marshallese language, and so some volunteers helped out with that, or helping out with the Jumbo Arts Club, which is like a local arts club in the Marshall Islands. So there's different things. So if you're on your own, you have to kind of seek that out a little bit more. If you're living with a host family, I say my best advice is just to say yes and just do things with them.
That's great, Melissa. And what do you think, Christian? Anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I basically agree with what everyone has said so far. And then just going off of that, I think another big thing, just part of Marshallese culture, is that, there's the whole thing about island time, things not happening when they say they're going to happen. So you might have like an event that's on paper scheduled for 3 o'clock, but much more likely it's not going to start until like 8 or 9 in the evening. And that's kind of just like part of the culture, just kind of waiting and just like being together and talking. Some of my favorite memories were, waiting for an event to happen that was supposed to happen 3 hours ago, but then you ended up just sitting around with a bunch of people, chatting, talking, and getting to know each other. And I think that's part of the culture as well, just that kind of waiting and just being together and chatting with each other.
Great. Thank you all so much for those insights. I think they're really valuable for anybody headed to the Marshalls. And now we'll switch our topic to the reason we're all headed to the Marshalls to begin with, to teach. And I know from my own time spent teaching abroad that the impact of my students in the school and my experience was just immeasurable. And I have so many fond memories of my time as a teacher in the community. So we'll start with Caroline. And Caroline, I'd like to ask you the following. What is your day-to-day teaching schedule at the school, and what sort of resources do you have in your classroom?
Okay, so I teach grades 3 and 6. I have 2 sections for grade 3 and just 1 for grade 6. And I just do English, and it's 90 minutes a class. That follows the public school system, the Ministry of Education, standards or what they want. And I teach grades 3 and 6 because those are 2 that take the standardized test here in the islands. So it's what my principal asked me to do. And my resources, since I'm on Mazro, I can go and buy almost anything I need for the classroom, like if I need more markers or paper, really anything like that. And then the school itself has internet. It has a few desktop computers, a printer, and a copier. However, our paper supply for the school use or the toner and the ink are typically not present, neither one or the other or both. So making copies and like actually passing out papers isn't really an option for teaching. It's a lot of writing on the board, which is a chalkboard, but it works out just fine. And then I have a handful of textbooks to use for my students. And then my mom got 5 boxes of picture books donated, and she sent them on a boat. So I actually have a little classroom library to use too, but that's not really the norm even on Mazro. That was kind of being spoiled.
That's great. Have you sent any pictures to your mom of the kids reading the books?
Definitely.
That's awesome. Great. And Carol, what was your day-to-day teaching schedule, and what sort of resources did you have?
So I taught classes or grades 1, 2, 5, and 6. There was another volunteer on the island with me both years, so they taught 3, 4, 7, and 8. So just again, I taught 1, 2, 5, and 6. So I taught 5 and 6 for 90 minutes each, and despite the Ministry of Education standard, sorry, I only taught an hour of English to 1st and 2nd grade, because that was just with the rotating schedule. It worked out easier that way. So I did not have my own classroom. I would just go into the existing classroom. All the classes I taught, there was only 1 class per grade on Namrik, but there was 1 class per grade. A lot of outer islands have to combine classes, so there might be like 1 class that is 1st and 2nd grade, and I didn't have to deal with that, which was great. That being said, everyone was still all over the place on their actual levels, so it probably wouldn't have made that much of a difference if I had had combined classes. In terms of resources, we did have some resources from the Ministry of Education or the public school system, whatever they're branding themselves as now. So I would say we usually had paper. I was given 2 pens every quarter, which was, you know, not enough, but a nice contribution. And there was usually chalk, and then there was just a very, very random selection of resources, I would say, beyond that. There were some crayons, there were some posters. The island where I was, Namrik, has had volunteers for the better part of the time that World Teach has been in placing in the Marshall Islands, which is like 10 or 11, 12 years, I'm not even sure. And so we had a closet that was devoted to World Teach that was just like somewhere between a lot of trash that had kind of collected over the years, but also had some really great resources, like craft supplies, extra paper, construction paper, and stuff like that. I definitely brought supplies with me. Didn't bring a ton the first year just because I didn't really know what I would need. So I did get some, and like Caroline said, you can get pretty much anything at Mazro. And if you do get to island and realize, oh no, I need pencil sharpeners because these kids will sharpen their pencils with knives in class if you don't bring a pencil sharpener, you can definitely get someone in Mazro to hook you up. In my second year, I did bring some school supplies specifically because I knew more what I needed, which was really nice. But overall, I still tried to keep it really minimal just because, one, my budget was, you know, non-existent. And also just introducing new things, and like I introduced glitter glue, and like that was a whole period. Like that glitter glue, just discovering that the glitter could be squeezed out of the tube. So I kind of had to balance the things that I was introducing, because if it was too interesting, the whole lesson was pretty much shot. So in terms of textbooks, I had textbooks. I don't think I had a class set of any textbook, but I did have a variety of different textbooks. So I had probably between 5 and 10 textbooks of several different types, some of which were the Moving into English, which is the official textbook that World Teach was using, at least while I was there. And I also had some just random textbooks that were just normal, not geared towards second language learners. So a lot of times I would just kind of shift those around. I skipped a lot of the stories in them anyway because they were just complicated, too much other stuff. So it was actually nice to have a couple different options because I could pick and choose stories that I thought were appropriate for the students. So the textbooks worked out okay. And they were always fine with sharing books because they were very used to it. And in terms of how theoretically NAMRIC has internet, but of the 3 years I've been familiar with it, 2 years teaching and then this year, it's actually had internet access maybe 25% of the time. And even when it does have internet access, it's like, okay, we're gonna sit on the internet for an hour. 2 people can check their email and like we can get a couple headlines, but no news articles are actually gonna load. So that's kind of the speed you were dealing with. So it wasn't exactly like, oh, let me just hop on and look up ideas for my next project. You had to know exactly what you wanted and it had to not be very much. But it was great when I needed to look up lyrics to Moana songs instead of having to write them all out myself. So that was internet, and I had to have my own computer for that. There was no computer. We did have a printer and a copier, but as Caroline kind of said, it was very hit and miss on to whether we had ink, as to whether we had printer paper, as to whether we had electricity to power the copier and printer. Yeah, pretty much anything that can go wrong will go wrong kind of thing. The school was out of power for 7 or 8 months while I was there. So during that time, there was no power in the classrooms, there was no printing, there was no copying. So you just kind of never counted on it. But it was really nice when you could make tests, print it out, make copies. It was amazing. But only happened, I think we gave quarterly tests. I think only one of them was I able to print and copy all of my tests. So that was not really something I ever relied on.
Thanks, Carol. That's such a great description. And I think, it's self-evident what some of the challenges are in a classroom when you have not only limited resources, but unreliable resources, not being able to know necessarily one semester or even one day to the next what you might be dealing with. And I think that applies well to my next question. Caroline, what are some of the cultural challenges that you have encountered in the classroom?
Some cultural challenges I think would just be like language barrier has been a big thing with my 3rd grade students. And then I think they have like expectations of what all Westerners are like, and I don't fit those expectations sometimes. And I think it just kind of like confuses them on the world. So that's been kind of, it's like a humorous experience though. Culturally, like Christian had said, island time is very big. So sometimes students will walk into class 20 minutes late, or the bell will ring from lunch period and they'll come in late, and that really frustrates me, but it's just how it is here. They don't get punished or anything for being late. It's just their island time. Other than that, culturally, there aren't a lot of challenges. I think being on Mazra, they do kind of know more about like American people, things like that. So they like know what to expect.
Great, thank you, Caroline. And Carol, how about you? Were there any cultural challenges that you encountered?
So I will definitely second the idea that like I was I was the American, and that was, you know, one of my students all the time would be like, well, aren't you going to watch the sunset? And I'd be like, yeah, no, not tonight. And she'd be like, but rebelles, which white people, rebelles love sunsets. And I'm like, all rebelles, like all 4 that you've met, like, are we, you know? So there's definitely a lot of issues with being told, like, well, Paul did it this way. Like, well, when Rebecca was our teacher, we got to do this. And you're kind of like, great, Rebecca's in America, Carol's here. So I definitely felt that. And also just in between, because like I said, there were 2 teachers on my island. So there would be times where they'd be like, well, Kim's class gets to do this. And I'm like, cool. Hopefully you're in 7th grade next year and you can be in Kim's class. But right now you're in mine. And I definitely felt that more because it was just like white people are the same. So there's that. The other real cultural challenge I found, especially with the little kids, was that you say yes, you agree. So I say, do you understand? And you say yes. And then I say, okay, do it. And you just stare blankly at me because you've understood nothing. So that was something I definitely had to get past, with the idea that, like, you can tell me no. You can't tell me no, I'm not doing this, but you can tell me, like, I don't understand this, or I don't agree, or you can disagree with me. And with that also, so in Marshallese culture, you, like, don't necessarily say yes, you, like, raise your eyebrows. And if you want to say no, you, like, kind of crease your eyebrows. And if you want to say maybe, you can just kind of, like, make a maybe face. It's really hard to describe. But a lot of times, like, kids doing things like that, where I'm like, do you understand? And they're, like, raising their eyebrows, and I just, like, don't process it. So that was something I really had to adjust to, because it took me a couple months to realize, like, the kids were answering my questions. And usually they were just saying yes because it was a question, so the answer is yes. But so working all that out was definitely an issue, because the number of times kids told me, like, they understood instructions, and then I was like, okay, do it, and they were just, you know, didn't know which way was up. Another issue, and this kind of goes with being American too, was that I did special things with them. So we would go on field trips, and I would bring in, like, craft supplies, and we'd do an activity and things like that. And because I would do that maybe once a week, they wanted it every day. And I would play more games with them than the Marshallese teachers. Marshallese teaching is very lecture oriented, very, like, here's the information, learn it. And that wasn't how I taught. So I definitely had a lot of issue being like, no, like, today you just have to sit there and be bored. Like, today is boring. I'm sorry, you have to learn today. So that was something that I sometimes had issues with. So that wasn't exactly a cultural challenge, but I guess it was because I was different. You know, they would ask me sometimes to go on a field trip every day. And I'm just like, you know, I'm sorry. Like, I worked so hard to tie that in yesterday. Like, I cannot justify it again today. And so then the other thing, tying in with island time and being late, that Caroline was talking about, is there's not a huge emphasis on education. Some kids are super motivated, amazing students, work so hard in school. Some parents are very supportive. I definitely knew some parents who, like, kicked their kids out the door in the morning. But on the other hand, a lot of parents aren't super concerned about it, or if there's something else going on, they're just, like, not going to push the kids to go to school. Some of the kids had to walk to school pretty far on my island because it was very long, and it was the only school on the island. So some kids had to walk 1 or 2 miles to school. And so that's a lot of time for them to get distracted and not show up. So there was just, like, a generally, yeah, there was, I would say, an uneven emphasis on education, because some people were very, very, thought it was very important. Other people were kind of like, like, it's fine. Especially kids who kind of saw their options for the future as, like, well, I'm going to grow up, like, I want to stay on this island. And realistically, you don't need a lot of education to stay on an outer island and make copra, which is a coconut product, or weave for the women. So it was hard to motivate some of those kids, especially ones who just weren't doing as well in school in the first place. A lot of times they weren't doing well because they didn't show up a lot. But then on the other hand, the kids were super, super motivated, super great. I had a lot of support from the mayor of my island, and also just from the other teachers. We're all mostly pretty great. They sometimes had some absentee issues, but for the most part, everyone was pretty great in the actual school system. But definitely the not being as worried about education was an issue.
Thanks, Carol. That's really insightful, and thank you, Caroline, as well for your answer before. I think it's really great to know what some of the challenges you might be stepping into are, and I'm struck by how some are so unique to the Marshalls, and then some are so unique to first year and fifth year teachers. So it's great to hear more about them. So this last title is a little facetious, but I think that all of our panelists might agree with me about just how fast this year can go. While it may be tough to try to sum up such an indescribable and transformative year in a few words in the spirit of doing our best, I'll ask our panelists 2 final quick questions about how their experiences in the Marshalls have impacted them. So we'll first ask Carol and Caroline. What are some of the most vital skills or perspective that you took away from your experience? And we can start with Carol.
So some of the most vital things I took away from my experience is huge and very ineffable. I would say I changed a lot as a person, definitely for the better over my 2 years there. Learned a lot about just like how big the world is and how small the world is, and definitely took away a lot of great skills of just like adapting to hardship and like just handling things and just like handling weird stressors and just not knowing what's going to happen and being okay with it, which was a very interesting adjustment to just kind of have to float through the day where like half the time the 6-year-olds are more informed than you. Like it's so awkward to like get used to asking a first grader, you know, hey, what's going on right now? But you know, that was my life for 2 years. And so just a lot of takeaways like that. And I definitely see how that translates to the position I'm in now, where I'm living in Haiti and just living in a different culture, handling that adjustment, living without hot showers, you know. It takes a little practice.
Great, Carol, thank you. And Caroline, I know your year isn't over yet. I'm not trying to rush you, but what would you say so far are some of the most vital skills or perspective that you've taken away?
I would say the 2 big ones would be flexibility and patience. I went to school to be a teacher, so this is my first year actually being solo in the classroom, and it's definitely taught me to be patient with the students and has given me like really good teaching skills to use for my future. And then in school and just in life here, being flexible with plans and time, things like that. I think the year is just a really good way to get a new perspective on life. And I just kind of shocked myself with how much I really can do and what I'm willing to do, like say yes to. So it's just been a good year so far of building those skills and becoming just a more whole person.
That's wonderful, Caroline. Thank you for sharing that. And we are coming up on the end of the hour, so we'll end with a final round robin quick question for everyone, so field staff and for Caroline and Carol. So we could start with, let's say, Melissa. Melissa, if you could choose one, what would you say has been your favorite memory or one of your favorite aspects of living in the Marshall Islands?
I've really enjoyed doing all the site visits. So one perk of my job is that I get to travel out to all the different sites where the various volunteers are living and working, and just getting to stay with their families, getting to kind of see them in their communities. And then while we're out there, they like to kind of show off their island, show me the highlights, And that's been amazing. I think one of my favorite trips was in Jalawit Atoll. They took me to a site that had a bunch of Japanese World War II ruins, and they were just kind of in this swampy, jungly area. It was all overgrown, and they were like climbing through this swampy area, and you're like, oh, and there's a cannon. Or, oh, there's a big building. What's that doing there? So it's just been a great time here and just getting to experience all the different parts of the Marshall Islands.
That's so cool, and it's great that you get to see such a wide variety of placements as well. And then we'll go next to Christian. So Christian, as a assistant field director and former volunteer, choose from either one. But what would you say has been your favorite aspect or memory of living in the Marshall Islands?
Well, there's so many to choose from, but I think the thing that stands out most would be last year when I was a volunteer in my island, just seeing like that moment at graduation at the end of the year when I saw all of the progress that my students had made. You know, we had gone through our trials and our challenges throughout the year, but like seeing where they had come and thinking back to where we had started at the beginning of the year together, it was just amazing to see that progress by the end of the year.
That's great, thank you. Caroline, what would you say?
As a teacher, I think one of my favorite moments was when I did a lesson that involved making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And it was a time that the majority of my students had their first PB&J. So it was just really cool to teach them, but then also give them a new life experience. That's something that I thought was normal and I grew up with regularly.
Awesome. And Carol?
So I had a lot of great moments in the classroom, like Christian saying, seeing how much I was actually teaching the kids. But my favorite overall thing was probably just like becoming part of my host family. So we had a baby in my host family who was 4 months when I arrived and just over 2 years when I left. And because of shifting family situation in my second year and some family drama, I really stepped up how much I helped taking care of him and even taking care of some of the older kids a little bit, and just became like a third parent in a lot of ways to him. And that was a really great experience to just like, I felt by the end that I was actually like seen as an equal in my family, because at the beginning you kind of feel like a child because you don't know how to do anything, and by the end I was like taking care of the baby and sometimes helping make food and like doing things that Marshallese adult women do, and that was a really great feeling.
That's great. Those answers sum it up so well. The life cycle of a World Teach Marshall Islands volunteer. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone so much for your insights and your experiences. And I know we have a few questions from the audience, so we'll be getting to those very shortly. I'll just really quickly show the application process slide. I'll let you guys read this in more detail, and of course you can always feel free to reach out to admissions@worldteach.org for more specific questions. But the important thing to know from this application material slide is that we would require a resume, a personal statement, and a transcript. And then in the second stage of the application, you'll have an interview with a member of our staff, and then one letter of recommendation would be submitted on your behalf as well. And another very important thing to notice is that the applications will be accepted on a rolling basis until May 1st, and then you'd be finding out within 2, at the most 3 weeks after you've completed your application. And this didn't come up prior, but I think a really valuable aspect of the World Teach experience is the option to participate in the TEFL certification as well. I think that's a really valuable certification that adds on a lot to your professional development and your experience. So I will make a plug for that. And then in the interest of time, I'll move quickly on to the next slide. This slide just covers all of the things that are covered through the funding that the public school system of the Marshall Islands provides for this program. So it's, you've met 2 members of our field staff on this webinar today who are always just there to help and are offering 24-hour in-country staff support. You have access to the alumni group as well as remote teacher quality support, overseas health insurance, the orientation, and then in addition to orientation, mid-service and an end-of-service training conference. So there's a lot more that we could say about that. But I know that I also want to get to some audience questions as well. So I'll leave that up while I look and see what questions we might have. So let me see. It looks as though a few of these questions have already been addressed, but maybe we could address a little bit. One of the questions, and Melissa, you might want to jump in here, is when people are placed with a host family versus dormitory or in-teacher housing. And I'll take a stab at that. So upon acceptance and confirmation into the program, you would fill out something called the volunteer profile form. And on that form, you would list any major preferences that you have with regards to housing or accommodations or other aspects of the experience. Once all those forms are collected, we're able to make the placements. You typically won't find out too much information about your placement until a few weeks before departure. And that's due to all the logistics that go into placing people in the right community for them. So Melissa, I don't know if you had anything to add on to about that, about how you decide how people are placed.
Yeah, well, you use the preference form to see what their preferences are. So obviously, if someone really does not want to teach either high school or elementary school, we want them to be happy. If you don't want to be in Madro, then we want you to be in an island where you're going to have the most productive year. That being said, if you choose something like Outer Elementary School, well, your only option is to live with the host family. So most of the time, the teacher housing is going to be with the high schools. And it's kind of difficult, actually, if you're going to be in a high school, to have host family housing. So that could be something you take into consideration. If you really want a host family experience, then you probably will have to teach elementary school. And if you want to live in a dorm or teacher housing, it's most likely going to be high school. Although we do have exceptions to those rules. It's just what's available that year, which islands we're going to be on, because we change the islands every year according to the needs of the public school system. So we kind of see what they're asking for, and then we have to look at the available housing around that school.
That's great, Melissa. Thank you for that in-depth answer. And I think really anyone could chime in for this next one, although Melissa and Christian might have the most 360 view. But do volunteers who live with host families ever have the opportunity to cook for themselves, or do you generally eat with the host families most of the time?
I'll take a stab at it. So I am with my host family, and when I tried to cook, they kind of shoo me away. They think of it as their responsibility and like they want to do it for me. But as the year has moved on, they've become more comfortable with me being in the kitchen. And actually for Cinco de Mayo coming up, we're going to make fajitas together. And they let me do like a little bit here and there. But like I said, my personal host family really likes to cook for me. I've heard of another volunteer who she makes her own breakfast and lunch every day, and then her host family just makes dinner for her. So it is kind of dependent on your family, but I think the majority of the time your host family cooks for you unless you really go out of your way to cook for everyone else.
I would definitely second that. Cooking for me, like just joining in on helping my host family cook, was like something I had to earn and like prove. And I definitely got like really simple jobs at first that slowly escalated as I showed that, I am a
Just quickly jumping in on that, from the male perspective, I think a big thing here in the Marshall Islands is just gender roles in general. They're much more strict than we might expect somewhere else. So as a guy, even I love cooking, but that was more seen as a women's role in the Marshall Islands, especially in my family. So even though I offered dozens upon dozens of times to help cook or like cook them a meal one day, they were of the impression that men shouldn't be doing that and that it was more a women's thing to do.
Thank you all. Those are really great insights. Very interesting. And I'm not seeing any other audience questions at the moment. And since it is a little past 9, I think it's time for us to say goodbye, but I'd really like to give a huge thank you to all of our panelists today, the field staff and the volunteers. You guys just provided so much excellent insight into your own experience, so thank you so much for that. And thank you, our attendees, for being here and listening to their stories. We really appreciate it. Feel free, questions are not over. We promise we'll answer them if you email us at admissions@worldteach.org or if you give us a call at our office. We'd be happy to answer any other questions that come up. And once again, thank you all for being here, and we hope you have a great evening. Thank you all.